here today in Lockhart, Texas, to meet with local historian Donaly Brice. He probably knows more about this Battle of Plum Creek than anybody I know, even more than Chuck Parsons, which is hard to believe. But anyway, we're here. We're going to meet him in a few minutes and go to several sites where this was more of a running battle. So we're going to go to most all the sites where it took place. So we'll see you in just a minute.
Back in 1840, Texas was having a real problem with the Comanche Indians. They were probably the fiercest Indian tribe that the Texans had to deal with. And it made it worse when Sam Houston left office as president of the Republic of Texas and Mirabeau B. Lamar was inaugurated. Sam Houston wanted to get along with the Indians and the Mexicans, and Lamar's policy was the opposite of Sam Houston's. Lamar felt like he wanted to either exterminate or rid Texas of all Indians. And so the Indian policy changed drastically just before 1840. By that year, the Comanches were willing to negotiate for a peace treaty, and so early in 1840 the Indians approached the people in the town of San Antonio, which wasn't but a small town at that time, and they wanted to deal with the Texans and negotiate this peace treaty. The Texans told them that they would deal with them only if they brought in all the white captives that they had taken in the past. The Indians agreed that they would do so, and they were to go back to their villages and bring in all the white captives that they had. In March of 1840, the Indians returned to San Antonio, and this time they brought with them about 65 of their people, men, women, and children. And with them there were 12 Comanche chiefs. These chiefs were going to negotiate with the Texans. Well, the Texans had no trust in the Comanche, and the Republic government sent several units of Texas militia and Texas troops to San Antonio to be there in case trouble broke out. And the Indians arrived in San Antonio on March 19th. They were taken into the town to the Alamo Plaza, and they met in a building, an old courtroom building called the Council House. And it was there that they were supposed to negotiate this peace treaty. Well, with them, they only brought one white captive, a young girl, a teenage girl named Matilda Lockhart. And the first thing they did when the Texans got the Indians in the Council House, they asked them, where are all the captives you were supposed to bring in? And they said, this is the only one that we have. If there are other captives there with other tribes that we don't know about. Well, Matilda Lockhart told the Texans that this was not true, and the Texans believed her and did not believe the Comanche. And so they said, well, we don't believe that you're telling us the truth, and we're going to hold you as hostages until your people can go back to your campsites and bring in all of the other white captives. The Comanche chiefs were not going to go for that. They were not going to be held as hostages, and so they armed themselves and tried to fight their way out of the council house. With the armed troops surrounding them, they tried to fight their way out, and several people were killed and wounded, shooting erupted in the council house by the Texas soldiers, and when it was all said and done, all 12 of the Comanche chiefs lay dead in the council house. Outside, the warriors and other people in the tribe heard what was going on, and they turned on all the people there in San Antonio who had come down to the Alamo Plaza to watch the Comanches and to see them up close. And so this ended up creating another bad situation. The situation happened when the Comanche people outside of the council house heard all the commotion that was going on inside. They realized what was happening, and they turned on the the people and the citizens of San Antonio. Fighting erupted in the streets of San Antonio. People were killed and wounded, and by the end of the fight, all of the Comanche, 64 out of 65 Comanche, were killed or captured in this fight. And the Texans lost 7 who were killed and 8 were wounded. The Texans realized that the Comanche were going to really be upset with the situation as it was and with the death of their chiefs, and expected there to be some retaliation on the part of the Comanches. So the Texans were expecting this all of the summer of 1840. It was a long, hot summer, and by August of 1840, the Comanche finally gathered up enough forces to retaliate in the form of a large war party that raided all the way from the Texas Hill Country above Austin all the way down to the Texas coast, which was about 150 miles away. The Comanches started down from the Texas Hill Country to make a large raid all the way to the Texas coast. This area that we're standing in today is just east of the town of Lockhart in Calhoun County. This area in 1840 was a total wilderness. It was out beyond the western frontier of Texas. There were no people living out here except for 2 families. One of them was the family of Isham Good, and another was John A. Neal, who lived about a mile further away from here. And the Indians had no trouble getting through this area undetected because there was no one living out here. And the Indians came down out of the hill country, and they skirted around the town of Gonzales to the east and went all the way down to Victoria before they attacked the town of Victoria. And the people of Victoria, the citizens there, had no idea that there were hostile Indians in their area until the Indians swept down on them from the north and invaded the town. The people fled in terror toward the center of the town, where they took up a central place where they could defend themselves in the downtown area. And it was there that a number of people were actually killed, and a bunch of buildings in the town were destroyed and burned by the Indians. The Indians also captured several thousand head of horses and mules that had been staked out on the prairies there near Victoria, that had been brought in to sell or trade to the Texans by Mexican traders from down in South Texas. The Indians broke off their attack as it got late in the evening, and they got to Spring Creek, where they set up their encampment for the night. the following morning again attacked the town of Victoria. But by then, word had spread. People from Victoria, some of the men had sneaked out of the town during the night and had spread to other places to warn people that there was a hostile Indian party in the vicinity, and that they needed to be on the alert for the Comanche. And so word was spreading all over central Texas very quickly by these runners that left from Victoria. After the second day of being invaded by the Comanche, the Indians decided to break off their attack and head off in the direction of the Texas coast down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they again attacked another town called Linnville, which was an early seaport along the Texas coast on Lavaca Bay. And it was here that they swept down on the little town of maybe 200 or 300 people. And since the town was right on the coastline, and they had wharves and docks out into the water of the bay, the people of the town had no place to go to escape the Indians when they swept down on them, except to wade out into the shallow waters of Lavaca Bay and get on little boats that were anchored or moored offshore. And it was at this point that the Comanche swept into the town and killed a number of people, and they took all of the goods that were in the warehouses along the coast there at the port town, and then they burned the whole town of Linnville to the ground. It was then that the Comanche loaded all of this plunder onto the many horses and mules that they had captured at Victoria, and they started back up toward the hill country with all of this plunder that they had gotten on this raid. Well, they were on their way back, and the Texans realized they were going to have to congregate somewhere between the Indians and the Texas hill country in order to stop the Indians from getting back to Comancheria up in the Texas hill country, because no one lived up in that area except the Comanche and other tribes, and they had no idea anything about the terrain up in that part of the country. So they had to stop them somewhere where they knew where they were. They decided on Isham Good's cabin, which was about halfway between Austin and Gonzales. And we're standing on the road that was built in 1839 from Austin to Gonzales. And it was on this road that the Texans decided they were going to intercept the Indians. As I said, Isham Good had set up his cabin right out here on this road, which had just been established in about the mid-1839. And early in 1840, he had moved his family out here and built a cabin, which was about a mile or so from Plum Creek, which is to our west. And this was a good place for the Texans to meet, to congregate, to intercept the Indians before they got back into the Texas hill country. And this is what they did. They sent word out to Gonzales, to Bastrop, LaGrange, Austin, Seguin, San Antonio, and many other places, telling the people to come quickly and join the volunteer forces that were going to stop the invading Comanche and Kiowa Indians from attacking or from getting back to their homes in the hill country. And so people started congregating on the road here where we're standing. People began congregating here or close to this road at Isham Good's cabin about August the 11th. And by the night of August 11th, there were about 100 men who had congregated at his home. The following morning, on August 12th, the men all got together and started off to go down to Plum Creek, which was about a mile or two from Isham Good's house. And they were going to cross over the creek and meet the Comanche as they were coming north, going back to their home villages. It was going to be a difficult fight for the Texans because they only had about 100 volunteers who had congregated, and unfortunately there were about 600 Comanche coming. Now, 600 Indians, that was a lot of Indians, and there were more than just the Comanche. There were some Kiowa, there were women and children. Practically all of the tribe's people had gone on this expedition with the Indians all the way to the Texas coast. And the Texans, like I said, had only about 100 men, and they were very highly outnumbered. They decided that they had heard that General Edward Burleson from Bastrop, about 25 miles to the east of us, was on his way with other men to fight, and they desperately needed these volunteers, these additional men to help in the fight on Plum Creek. The Texans went on down to the creek. They sent out several scouts down the creek to determine where the Indians were exactly. And it wasn't long early that morning that the scouts returned and saying the Indians were coming. They were about 2 miles down the creek, or 2 or 3 miles down the creek, and that they would be getting there very quickly. So the Texans got armed. They started down the creek to meet the Indians who were coming up the creek, and they got to one point about a mile or so south of where we are, where they decided to lie low in the trees and the brush along the creek line and hide from the Indians who were coming up the prairie, up the creek. And while they were waiting for the Indians, a runner came saying that Edward Burleson was getting very close and to hold off on the fighting because he was coming with about 100 more men, which would double the size of the Texas volunteers, and was necessary. They needed them really bad, and so they decided they would hold off as long as possible to do this. Burleson was coming from Bastrop, which was 25 miles away, and along with him, he was bringing 13 Tonquah Indian allies with him. The Tonquahs hated the Comanche because in the years past, the Tonquahs had lost their land to the Comanches, who had come into this country from up in the northern states, and they wanted to, they just would take over any land that Indians had. And the Tonquahs did not like Comanches at all. And so anytime the Texans were going on an expedition to fight Indians, or the Comanche particularly, Tonquahs liked to go along as scouts or guides and participate in the fight. And this is what they did. Burleson left Bastrop and had almost gotten to the site where the Battle of Plum Creek took place. He was a couple of miles from there, and word got to him he had to hurry because the Indians were already in sight, and so he put his horses into a trot to get here quickly. Unfortunately, the Tonquah had no horses when they left Bastrop, and they were running alongside the mounted Texans until they got within several miles of here. And from that point, the Texans goaded their horses or spurred their horses into a trot. The Tonquahs actually kept up with the Texans on foot. This is a 25-mile run for these men, and they made it all the way to Plum Creek. The Texans really were happy to see Burleson and his men because it doubled the size of the Texas forces. The arrival of Burleson and the Tonquah Indians doubled the size of the Texas forces, which was desperately needed. And so the Texans, by the time Burleson arrived, the Indians had already gone past where the Texans were hiding in wait. And Burleson finally arrived, and when he got there, the Texans came out of the brush onto the prairie along Plum Creek, and it was there that the Indians finally realized that they were in an ambush there. And the Texans fell in right behind the Indians with all of their horses, with the plunder on them, and skirmishing took place from the rear guard of the Indians and the advance guard of the Texans. This skirmishing lasted for about 5 miles as the Indians headed more or less northwest toward the Texas hill country. The Texans kept pushing the Indians, hoping to get them to stop and make a stand where they could have an actual fight with the Indians. But it took about 5 miles of going toward the hill country before they stopped. They pushed them as far as to a point that was known as Kelly Springs. And at Kelly Springs is where they forced the Indians to stop and make their stand. The main part of the fighting took place somewhere about 2 or 3 miles west of Lockhart, the town of Lockhart today. Of course, Lockhart wasn't here in 1840. The Battle of Plum Creek actually took place, the main part of the fighting took place it took about 45 minutes before the Indians were finally subdued, and they decided to break off their attack and retreat. What prompted this was that the Texans had seen one of the Comanche chiefs, who was very brave. He would run up toward the Texans, who had dismounted and formed a square, a defensive square where they were shooting at the Indians. And the Indians would charge and circle around the Texans who had dismounted. One of these chiefs particularly was noticeable because he would come up very close to the Texans and fire his arrows and then back off or outside the range of the Texans. And the Texans kept insisting that they had been hitting the Indian, but they never could knock him off his horse. They couldn't understand what was happening until they realized that he had a metal plate, or he was using for a shield, with it tied around his neck, and it was hanging down in front of him, and they were hitting the metal shield with their bullets or their musket balls, and he was escaping being killed. But they also noticed when he rushed up toward the Texans to fire his arrows, when he would get so close, he would rein in his horse as quickly as possible to turn around, and as he wheeled around, the shield that was hanging loose in front would fly up, exposing his body. And so they realized that maybe they could kill him as he was turning to get away. And so that's what they did. Several Texans fired at him as he wheeled in his horse, and sure enough, they killed him. and he fell off his horse. Several Indians, warriors, were killed trying to drag his body off the battlefield. He evidently was one of the more prominent leaders of the Comanche tribe. It was at this point that the Texans realized that the Indian spirit was broken, because the rest of the Indians were all huddled up in a grove of oak trees where the women and children were guarding the baggage and the plunder and the loot and the horses that they had captured down below at Victoria and Linnville. And they started wailing and carrying on about the loss of their chief, and the Texans urged General Felix Huston, who was in command of the Texas forces, that this was the time that the Texans should mount and charge the Indians, because their morale was low and their spirits were broken because of the loss of their chief. And this is what happened. The Texans mounted and they charged the Indians, who all fled in many directions, mostly up toward the Texas Hill Country, up to the northwest of where they were. The retreat and dispersal of the Comanche at the site just west of Lockhart ended the Great Comanche Raid and the Battle of Plum Creek. From there, the Indians fled back toward the hill country up above the headwaters of the San Marcos River and Austin. We're going down to the creek, to Plum Creek, where the Texans congregated and started down the creek where they intercepted the Indians. From there, we're going west to the site where the major part of the fighting at Plum Creek took place. This was at a point about 2 miles west of the town of Lockhart, and where the Indians were dispersed and fled. And we'll talk a little bit about the ending of the fight at that point. After the Indians had been intercepted on Plum Creek about 4 or 5 miles to the southeast of where we are right now, there was skirmishing between the Texans and the Comanche for about 4 or 5 miles. The Texans were trying to get the Indians to stop and make a stand where they could have a major battle. And it was at this point behind me where the Indians finally took up a position in the oak trees that you see over my left shoulder behind me. And the Indians then came out onto the open prairie to meet the Texans who were chasing them. And this is where the main, or the most intense part of the fighting at the Battle of Plum Creek took place. In that grove of oak trees behind me is where the rest of the tribe and the people had their horses that were loaded with plunder from their raids on Linnville and Victoria. Once the battle was over, the Indians scattered and fled off to the northwest toward the direction that I'm pointing, and were chased for another 16 to 18 miles until they reached the headwaters of the San Marcos River, where the town of San Marcos is located today. One interesting aspect of the Battle of Plum Creek is that after the battle, the men all returned to this point outside this grove of oak trees, and they all gathered at the end of the day after the fight, and along with them some of the Tonkawa Indians that were involved in the fight with Burleson's men that came in. They were there, and it was interesting that one of the men who wrote an account of the battle at Plum Creek was a man named Robert Hall, and he had been wounded in the battle, and he was lying there that evening close to this grove of oak trees, and he noticed some smell of something cooking, and it wasn't long before one of the Tonka Indians came over to him with a piece of meat on the end of a piece of a stick or a lance, and offered him something to eat. And it turned out this piece of meat was part of one of the Comanche Indians who had been killed in the battle. Now, the Tonkas had an interesting custom. Although they were not cannibalistic, they did believe that if you went into battle with your enemy and killed your enemy, if you were to take a part of their flesh and roast it and eat it, you would gain the power that from their enemy, and their enemy would lose that much power for future battles. So it was typical for the Tonka to roast part of their one of their enemies when they were killed after a battle, and this is what happened. And Robert Hall tells the story that although he was hungry, he wasn't sufficiently hungry enough to eat someone who he had possibly had sent to his maker to begin with. So it was interesting that this little event happened at the Battle of Plum Creek. There were a lot of interesting little stories about incidents that happened during the battle, which we don't have time to talk about, but I hope that you'll read more and study more about the Great Comanche Raid and the Battle of Plum Creek to learn about some of the more interesting and amusing things that happened to the men on this battle. It was quite interesting. For more information about the Great Comanche Raid and the Battle of Plum Creek, you might be interested in reading this book, The Great Comanche Raid, Boldest Indian Attack of the Texas Republic. It was published back in 1987 and is long out of print now, but we are trying to get the book reprinted with some revisions and additions, and the University of North Texas Press is planning to revise it and publish it in the next several years. You may be able to find copies of the book in local libraries, or you may find it online and where you buy books online too. So you can find a lot more details and information about what happened during this Great Comanche Raid through reading this book.